Thank you all for joining us. Once again, I'm Randall Foster. I am Chief Creative Officer of Symphonic, and you are here on the Music Industry 360 podcast. We are joined today by veteran music industry professional and president of the Music Business Association, Portia Sabin. I better correct myself. Dr. Portia Sabin.
Thank you, Randall. I am going to insist on that from now on. Doctor is, I worked hard for that. So I'm going to insist that you use that from now on.
Doctor, you earned that title. And I know from as many friends as I've had in academia that once you get that title, that's like the gold medal. You need to hang on to that with white knuckles. It's so interesting, a doctor of anthropology and education from Columbia University, obviously one of the most esteemed schools in America, but possibly the world, if you get real about it, made her way into the music business. I find it really fascinating because I feel like it might be a path less traveled. So I'm curious. I would love to just talk about your progression from your early days in New York, as a drummer and in that scene, and how you found your way to where you are today. So let's start at the very, very beginning. So where did you grow up? I apologize. That's the one bit of the bio I didn't have.
I grew up in New York City, in Manhattan, in Hell's Kitchen, which is the mid 40s and 50s on the west side over by the river. When it was still a neighborhood that was run by the Irish Mafia, who were called the Westies. And I did pretty well growing up there because I was a little redheaded girl. So of course they all, all the guys would come out of the bars in the morning and say, "Top of the morning to you, sweetheart," that sort of thing. So it was a pleasant, charming neighborhood when I grew up, not a rich neighborhood. The buildings over on 9th and 10th Avenue in Manhattan were built in the 1800s for those big immigrant families. And generally, most of the apartment buildings there had one bathroom in the hallway that was shared by all the apartments. We were lucky, my mother and I, to grow up in an apartment with the bathroom inside our apartment. And yet in our bathroom, you could sit on the toilet and wash your hands in the sink.
Well,
so it was that small.
That seems like
it was inside the apartment. So I felt good about that.
That's incredible. I'm learning a lot about you. I feel like I know you pretty okay, but I'm feeling I'm going to learn a lot about you today. So this is fun for me. So in your early days, like you are a percussionist drummer. You started out in the rock scene in Manhattan. What motivated you to get involved in music, and how did you get into that scene?
Well, I'm one of those people who was an early music fan. So I was about 10 when I started getting really into music on the radio. I bought my first vinyl record at 10. It was Jay Giles' band Freeze Frame. Yes, I'm very proud. And then I just became, one of those people who in junior high school and high school was all about the music. I was the kind of person who I wouldn't talk to you if you didn't like the right kind of band. All my friends liked the Smiths, and I wasn't going to talk to you if you didn't see the merits of the Smiths. My whole life was really built around, music. That was my big identity point in high school. Also in high school, I decided that I also wanted to be a musician because I thought the best way to meet cute boy musicians was probably to be in a band rather than to be a groupie. That didn't seem like an interesting path for me. So I picked up the electric bass at age 14 and was a little disappointed to discover that all of the boys had picked up their instruments at 12. So by 14, they were all good at them and I was still crappy. And this was the 80s, so it was a little different then. It was a little bit harder. People, the guys that I knew were in police cover bands. So they clearly didn't want a bass player who couldn't play a police riff, It wasn't good. So I didn't get into a band until I got to college. But then the minute I got into college, I started playing in bands as a bass player. And I played bass through bands all through my first 3 years of college. And then my senior year, I actually showed up at a new band practice, and my friend Tamara was sitting behind the drums. And it was like something happened in my brain. And I just said to her, I was like, do you know how to play drums? And she's like, no, but there's a drum room here on campus and you can take lessons, and it's $100 for the whole semester. And I literally like ran out of that band practice, ran to the drum room, like put down my $100. I was like, when can I start? It's like, it just was something clicked. And I took one drum lesson, very proud, one drum lesson. And the very next day got into a Pixies cover band, which shows you how far the boys had come, because I was in a Pixies cover band. Then after one drum lesson with four dudes who were the kindest boys because they put up with, I mean, I couldn't play at all, you know, it was real bad. And David Lovering is one of my favorite drummers. So, you know, I was butchering his work completely, but it was like a disease. Like I was just completely hooked. I never wanted to do anything but play drums. And so I didn't. I played drums all through that year. And then I was in a band at the end of that year. That band, when we graduated, we moved to Minneapolis to make it in the music business, which we totally didn't do. But we did play out a lot in Minneapolis. You know, I got to play Uptown. I got to play First Avenue. You know, the 7th Street entry, obviously not the main stage. But, you know, that was historic and exciting because, you know, Husker Du and the Replacements. And, you know, I met the drummer for Babes in Toyland on a porch at somebody's party one time. And I couldn't even talk to her because I was so like incredibly starstruck. So, you know, I lived in Minneapolis for about a year and played in a bunch of different bands. And then when I went home to New York, Minneapolis and I were not a fit. I don't go for the like 60 below. And then they also don't tell you that, you know, when it's not 60 below there, it's like super hot and there's mosquitoes the size of your head. So it's like none of the seasons of Minneapolis worked for me. So I was like, I called my mom and I was like, can I just come home? And she was like, yeah, you can come home. What the hell? So I went back to New York, and the very first thing I did when I got back to New York was I opened the Village Voice. This is the days before the internet. And I went through the classified ads and I found a band looking for a drummer. It happened to be an all-female band. And I was like, well, I've never done that before. Let's try that. So I got into a band literally 3 days after I got back to New York. And I played in bands for 10 years, for the next 10 years in New York. Now, the secret of my PhD is that, you know, a couple months after I got back to New York and was playing in this band, I realized I had to do something with my life that wasn't this. Or else my mother was going to be like really mad that she'd spent all this money on, you know, a nice liberal arts college and all of the above. So I actually enrolled in grad school, largely just to make my mother happy. I was always interested in anthropology. I had part of my major in college was anthropology. So, you know, I was interested, but it was, I would say 60% just to kind of keep my mom off my back.
PhD by necessity.
For PhD by necessity, exactly. And I could have dropped out at any point, but I really ended up loving it. And so I went for the whole time. So during that time, after first few years, I ended up getting into a band that was kind of serious. We were called the Hissy Fits. And we ended up making a couple of records. We went on tour. We ended up, you know, sort of moving up the food chain a little bit and became a little bit known in New York. We had a song that was played on alternative radio, and you know, it was a little bit of a, you know, we started to get some of that momentum and heat. And then when we broke up, I decided to take that little piece of knowledge that I had gained, which I felt made me dangerous, and start managing some other bands. So when I left the Hissy Fits, I started managing bands, and I started my own management company, and I managed bands for about 10 years. And that was how I ended up managing a band called The Gossip. The Gossip ended up going gold in the UK. So we had a big adventure with that. I signed them to Sony for a label deal and Chrysalis for publishing. And that was an exciting period of my life. And I learned a lot about how the music industry works and doesn't work.
I was going to add that actually. I imagine you gained another PhD in that process of sorts.
Yeah, it ended up being pretty crazy. And then I'm kind of skipping ahead. So if you want to stop me at some point,
No, you've got me. I'm riveted at this point.
Okay. So in the meantime, I had met a boy named Slim Moon, which is a hard name to forget, who ran a record label called Kill Rockstars. And I was a huge fan of Kill Rockstars. And I actually met him at a Slater-Kinney show. Slater-Kinney at the time was my favorite band. And my band, the Hissy Fits, had gone to see Slater-Kinney. And we were, Slim was there to see the band because obviously they were the hottest band on his label at that moment. And so we were introduced by a mutual friend. And so that is how we met. And we are celebrating our 22nd anniversary on the 19th of this month. So
that's my wedding anniversary.
May 19th, really?
Yes. Greatness.
No way.
Greatness. That's awesome. So quick question. When you met Slim, did you know Slim was the founder of Kill Rockstars, or was he just a cute boy and it was an extra perk that he was the founder of your favorite label?
No, actually, I knew who he was. But the funny thing is, I would only have known who he was via like liner notes, because Slim Moon is kind of a memorable name. And I remember like when I would read the Slater-Kinney liner notes, it would say, "Thanks, Slim Moon." And I was like, what a crazy name. In fact, I remember having a conversation with my boyfriend about the name Slim Moon when I was listening to a Slater-Kinney record.
It sounds a bit like a pseudonym, doesn't it? I mean,
I know, right? It's like nobody could be named Slim Moon. Like, what is his real name? That is bizarre. So I had known the name, but then here's the crazy part. So this guy who was our mutual friend who introduced us, he is a total shit talker, right? And he was shit talking Slim, and Slim was staying at his house. So even though he was like, "Oh, he's my best friend," he was telling me all this stuff about him. And like one of the things he'd said is, he's like, "Slim is the dirtiest person I've ever met. He smells, he's gross, he's really disgusting." So like I had heard this story. So when I got introduced at the show to this guy who looked like, I was like I was trying to figure out, I was like, is this the guy? Like, he seems really normal. So that was like initially kind of interesting, because I was like, what, am I going to find something out about him that's like, he's just going to like Pigpen, like bugs are going to jump off of him or something. Completely normal. T-shirt, jeans, baseball cap.
Smelling good is not punk rock. That's not a thing.
Clearly not. It's not usually very punk. And honestly, like having been married to him for 22 years, like he's not the cleanest person I've ever met in my life, but he's not like the image that I had in my head was not reality.
That's crazy. So I want to stop you at Kill Rockstars. Let's talk about that a little bit, because I, of course, came up and as a fan of great music and knew the label before I knew you, and was thrilled to meet you through A2IM and some of the other great organizations that you and I have been involved with over the last number of years. But you guys had an incredible run there. Obviously you met Slim, you married him. At what point did you transition into Kill Rockstars, and at what point did you transition into the leadership role at Kill Rockstars? So
I met Slim. That show, that Slater-Kinney show, was, I think, the All Hands on the Bad One tour. It was May of 2000. So we started dating. We did a long distance dating thing, took forever. I ended up moving out to the West Coast. We got married in 2004 on the day that I graduated with my PhD. So just a nice way to keep that date in our heads. We figured that would be helpful. So now my graduation day is our wedding anniversary, May 19th. So then after we got married and I finished my dissertation and actually, graduated, I got a postdoctoral fellowship, and I got a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Washington, which was interesting because Slim lived in Olympia, Washington. And so now I got this job in Seattle. So I was like, oh, I'll move out to the West Coast, live with Slim, and I will commute to Seattle, which was really stupid, because if anyone who's ever lived out there, Olympia to Seattle on a good day with no traffic is like an hour. On a bad day with traffic, it could be like your whole day. So I ended up actually having to get an apartment in Seattle for a while I did this postdoc. Now, in the meantime, I had started to manage The Gossip, and The Gossip had started to blow up. and go get really big in England. So the years of my postdoc were 2005 and 2006. And during 2006, I was like flying to England from Seattle like once a month and also trying to commute to Olympia. It was bananas. It really had gotten pretty crazy. And then in like April of 2006, like at the height of everything crazy, I came home one day and Slim was like, I think I want to do something different. I've been running this label for 15 years. I think I want to apply for this A&R job at Nonesuch. And if we get it, we should move to New York. And I was like, okay, like go for it if you want to do that. Well, he applied and he got the job. So now suddenly he's going to be an A&R guy at Nonesuch. We're going to move to New York. And I was like, what are you going to do with the label? And he's like, well, I was thinking about that. Do you want to take it over and you can shut it down? And I was like, what? And then I guess I went away and thought about it. And I was like, well, this is sort of my opportunity, right? Like I've spent the last 1 foot in music and 1 foot in academia. I knew by then that I didn't want to be a professor. That just wasn't, I love teaching, but that wasn't what I wanted to do. And this job that I had at the University of Washington was a research job, which I was really hating for reasons that, are a different podcast. Did not like that job. So I was basically being offered the opportunity to move full time into music and be able to, really devote all my time to my management clients and, run this label and shut it down. I was like, okay. So I decided to do it. So I took over Kill Rockstars. We moved to New York City the same month. So now I don't even have a staff. Like my staff is all back in Olympia. I'm in New York. And Slim had a lineup of 27 records that were supposed to come out in 2007. So 2007 was the year the Gossip went gold in the UK. So I actually spent a lot more time in Europe in 2007. And my staff, who were wonderful, just put out the 27 records. But during that year, I ended up signing a band called Horse Feathers. I signed the Thermals. I signed Tao, who at the time was Tao with the Get Down, Stay Down, is now just Tao. And I was like, this is fun. This is easy. I love this. I'm just going to keep doing this. So I never did shut down the label and I just kept going and I ran it for 13 years.
That's incredible. And of course, being in New York, then that commute to the UK was much easier.
Yeah, honestly, that really helped.
I can only imagine. See, I didn't know you were a manager, and it's interesting to see that transition from management to label. I may be just a little misinformed with regards to independent labels, but a slate of 27 releases in 1 year, that seems really aggressive. Was the label always that aggressive as far as the number of releases?
Slim on the Enneagram is a type 7, which is the enthusiast. So we always point to that. He always had an incredibly aggressive release schedule. And I think it's largely because he just would always get excited about a new band and then just have trouble saying no. When I ran the label, I got to say I was much more cautious, especially, the other thing I always say about Slim is that he's a visionary. And I think he saw the writing on the wall a little bit about the big revolution that was going to come, the end of physical and the beginning of digital. So I really feel like he kind of got out of the business right in time. But I had to preside over the label during that transition. And that was really, really tough.
And that was 2007. That was when Tower went down. I mean, I remember that almost like my parents talk about like the day JFK was shot. Like in my lifetime, in my professional career, the day Tower filed for bankruptcy is one of those zeitgeist moments for me.
It absolutely is. It absolutely is. And, as a label like Kill Rockstars, we were lucky because we had Elliott Smith, we had Slater Kinney, we had the Decemberists. So we had some catalog to carry us through the tough times. But that said, the closing of Tower, the collapse of retail, and then that weird moment between when, that happened and then when digital really kicked into being was super tough, as you well know. I think the year 2010, we put out one record because I had to just use all my money to keep my staff paid. I had to keep the doors open. I just couldn't afford to put anything out. So it was a tough time, but we weathered it. We got through it. we decided to start putting out alternative comedy albums, and that turned out to be a huge lifesaver as well as really great. And some of my favorite albums that we ever put out.
Was that about the time that you were named one of the top 1,000 comics in the world by Saturday?
Yeah, which I'll never understand that, but
I love it. I mean, you're on a list.
I know I'm on a list. I'm like, well, I think I'm funny, but I don't think anyone else knows I'm funny. So that's just a totally weird situation.
The collapse of digital and your resilience through it actually dovetails really nice into what would become your next act professionally, I think. In that I remember, and you may correct me here, but as far as I understand it, the Music Business Association is the newest iteration of what was formerly known and loved as NARM. Is that a correct assertion?
Yeah, that's completely correct.
Because I do remember NARM. I remember the NARM conventions, which for those listeners that weren't paying attention at that time, that was basically when the labels would go with their next 2 or 3 quarters worth of priorities and pitch them to the retailers. So Borders and Barnes and Noble and Tower and Virgin and all the reps from those stores would walk around this convention. And so when that physical stuff went away, all of a sudden we were left with this incredible business that has intricate needs and it has all sorts of, growth objectives, et cetera. But without one of the major platforms we were selling on. So I'm sure you can speak to the convergence from NARM into music biz, because I'm sure you were at least tangentially involved with that. Were you not? I mean, I know you weren't yet at the organization, but were you involved in some of those discussions?
No, I don't think I was very involved. I mean, the funny thing about music biz is that when NARM stopped being NARM, because I went to NARM when I ran Kill Rockstars, but a few times. But then when it went away and they rebranded as Music Biz, I had no idea that had happened. That was completely outside my purview. And in fact, it was years after that someone said to me, are you going to Music Biz this year? And I was like, what the hell is Music Biz? And, I had to be instructed because I had to go to the website and look it up. And I was like, oh my God, this conference is amazing. Look at all these people talking about all this stuff that I care about. I think, Randall, the reason, what happened to sort of get me from the label world to here is I started working on boards. So Slim had been a founding member of A2IM, which is the Independent Label Trade Association. And when he left Kill Rockstars, I inherited his seat. And I sat in his seat for like 6 months, and then they had an election and I got elected on my own recognizance or whatever merit. I got elected on my own merit. And then I ended up serving on that board for 12 years, for the next 12 years. And I did things at A2IM, like start the Libera Awards, which is their awards show. They didn't have an awards show. They wanted to do an awards show. And I said, how hard can it be to throw an awards show? I'll do that. It was hard. Let me tell you, I learned a lot. So I was on the board of A2IM for 12 years. I was asked to be on the board of the RIAA. I was on that board for 2 years. I was on the Recording Academy Board of Governors for about 6 or 7 years. And I just started to get excited about the business of music. I always say that I'm a music fan who turned into a music business fan. I really got excited about the workings of the industry. And around 2014, I actually started a podcast, which I felt at the time I was really late to the game, which is now hilarious to think about because now it seems like I'm this OG podcaster. So I've been doing a podcast since, officially the beginning of 2015 about the music business called The Future of What. And so I also started meeting a lot of people through the podcast, talking to people on the podcast, executives throughout the industry about all sorts of stuff, up and coming tech stuff, issues, legislation, blah, blah, blah. And I just really got interested in the issues and the business itself. And so when this music biz job came available in 2019, they just called me out of the blue. A headhunter called me, and I think it was because they'd been recommended. I'd been recommended by somebody that they knew, as someone who sort of had their finger on what was going on in the music industry. So for me, this music biz job is really kind of a perfect fit. because what Music Biz has become is, when it was NARM, it represented, the labels and the retailers and the distributors. And someone I was talking to the other day just said this in such an interesting manner. One of the biggest revolutions in the digital age has been that the major labels no longer control the means of distribution, which really is a big deal if you think about it. Because if you think about it, the majors they owned the distributors, and the retailers and the, labels were all sort of one unit. And the indie world, obviously we had connections, we could get into that world, which was great. But, they did control the means of distribution. Now the means of distribution is, Spotify, SoundCloud, it's other companies that are outside the major label system. So what Music Biz did, which was brilliant after they rebranded, was to invite in those other companies that are now the means of distribution in the industry. So on our board now, we have, Spotify, Amazon, Apple, we have Pandora, and a bunch of different companies in the last few years since I've been there. We've added a ton because we're really trying to capture all sectors of the industry. So it puts Music Biz in an interesting position in the industry because we represent both the copyright owners and the copyright users. So we try to be kind of a Switzerland where everybody can talk about upcoming issues, things that are affecting everyone, but we're not throwing tomatoes at each other on Capitol Hill.
You're the great peacekeepers. And those DSPs that are all involved. I mean, I have to say, and I know we are in the shadow of the upcoming impending Music Biz conference hosted here in Nashville annually, getting back to work, I'm so excited for your conference. But the informative sessions and things that I've had the pleasure of being in the room for there are really, really, really game changing. And getting those thought leaders all in one room and having, we're in a time where the mechanisms and the gatekeepers that we're concerned with now are the editors and really the algorithms at the DSPs. Having them talk to us about best practices and things, I think, is really a gift. Just having that ability, because otherwise it's hard to navigate this space.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it's critical that we all work together. I think that's sort of the bottom line is, there's always going to be areas in which people have differing opinions or are like outright against each other. This side wants this and this side wants that. But at the end of the day, I think it's much more fruitful for us to try to work together. And that's one thing, we're a trade association, and I don't know if, your listeners are familiar with what a trade association does, but one of the things trade associations do for their membership is advocate. So like an organization like the RIAA, they are very well equipped to advocate for the major label industry, right? So they have a bunch of lobbyists, their leadership is mostly lawyers, former lawyers. They just, they're very much set up for that advocacy piece. And we're really not. Like, that is not something that I see Music Biz. That's not a direction I see Music Biz going in, is the advocacy direction necessarily, because I just don't think, I don't think that's where, I don't think that's what we're organized to do, because I think that other people have, the DSPs have DEMA, everybody's sort of got their own little trade association that can advocate for them on Capitol Hill. One thing I'll say to that, which is totally unrelated, but that I have been a big champion of for a really long time, is I honestly believe that if we want change in the music industry and we want, artists compensated properly and to be able to continue being artists, which I really do believe everyone in the industry does want, because without artists, what everyone always says here in Nashville, they say it all starts with a song, right? Like, if there's no artists to write songs, then, everything we're doing is fruitless and futile. I think what we lack right now in the American landscape is a strong artists' rights organization. We really need that. I think we need a trade association that's for artists and that artists can utilize on their own behalf to lobby for their own interests.
No, absolutely. And I mean, to a certain degree, I think the American Federation of Musicians has tried to do that, at least for the performing musicians and sessions. But no, I think that would be a fantastic idea. So would you say, like, the primary really the primary goal of what you guys are doing is really the education outreach connection side of things obviously over the advocacy to Capitol Hill. That's really the goals of Musicbiz, or I'm sure you have a mission statement that I probably should have read before this call. But how would you distill those goals?
Yeah, I think our goal is to create the rooms in which the important conversations happen. That's really what we do, because we believe that everyone is going to be stronger when they talk to each other and listen to each other. So that's what we have tried to do throughout the pandemic. We were able to pivot. We put on over 70 virtual events, absolutely with the goal of educating the community, providing information. We worked with, all sorts of organizations. We did a Musicbiz Live. We did this Musicbiz Live weekly series throughout the pandemic. And like one episode was with Music Cares to talk about how artists could and other people in the industry could apply for money for support through Music Cares. We did one on mental health, how people could get mental health during the pandemic. We talked to NEVA when that organization, the Venue Trade Association, which is brand new, which was created during the pandemic, to talk about how folks could get help through that. We had, lawyers and business managers on to talk about how do you apply for an SBA loan. So a lot of our mission is that sort of educational piece and letting people know what's out there. I think there's another piece to the education part, which is also just generally understanding the music business. I've been a big advocate for that. Like I started my podcast with really that in mind. If artists are going to listen to this, I thought let's give them the information that they need to be successful in this industry. Because I still feel when I came out of my 13 years of running a label was that artists need this information to do well. And sometimes they just don't know it. So you need to give it to them. Sometimes you need to give it to them 7 times, so that they can get it. I mean, I think someone had to explain publishing to me at least 3 times before it sank in. And I have a PhD. So, publishing is extremely complicated. But also, there's like a weird sort of willfulness sometimes to some artists where they just don't want to know. They want, they're like, oh, I'm an artist. I just want to think about artistic things. And I really want to try to get people to understand you need to know this. Like, you're not going to be successful in this industry if you don't understand your own business, because this is a business, at the end of the day. And we don't need any more stories about artists that were taken advantage of by people in their lives because they didn't care enough to pay attention to the money, and today it's so much harder because, back in the day, it was really, you had 2 income streams as an artist, right? Touring and record sales. And now you've got 1,000 income streams. So it's just a different world and you really need to be on top of it.
No, I think that's absolutely right. I encounter artists all the time who are not the best stewards of their own business. Mm-hmm. And the reality is we all have those cautionary tales. We've all heard the horror stories, and a lot of those horror stories are still being unpacked right now with rights revisions and everything else that's going on. And it's totally. The good news is I feel like we are making progress as an industry. I feel like the altruistic goals of doing good in music are slowly coming true in many ways, I think. I was going to ask you, and I'm trying to, we're running out of time, but I've got a couple last things I want to ask you that are just eating me up. And you kind of touched on this a little bit, but I'm going to ask this of every person that I interview series for this podcast. And that is, this is a small question with a long answer possibly. And it might be a follow-up podcast at some point about this question alone. What do you think the biggest challenge is facing the industry overarching in 2022, and how do we overcome it?
I'm sure you'd agree there's a lot of issues that I think are important. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is always going to be at the top of my list because we have a duty as an industry to lead the way. We have so many artists of color, so many queer artists, trans artists, female artists, even if we're going to get right down to it. We need to always keep that at the front of our minds because, the diversity of our artist community is not reflected in our executive community as well as it should be. And so that I think always has to be at the forefront of our minds for whatever we do. The second biggest topic is probably like a perennial topic for the music industry, but it's really true today too, which is don't let tech leave us in the dust, because tech moves so fast and we have habitually in the music industry been left behind and had to play catch up. The whole mess of Napster and then the ensuing 20 plus years where, we couldn't get it together to figure out how, it's like, oh, we'll never sell music on a digital file. There, a lot of pain could have been avoided if we had sort of got with that program earlier. And right now, I feel like NFTs are a big one. It's like we're going to do a big track at Musicbiz on NFTs. And I think that that's part of the goal, is to really help people understand the issue and get that out into public knowledge, because that's another place where I feel like people could get left behind. Yes, maybe NFTs will be a flash in the pan and, 2 years from now, we won't even be talking about them. That's possible, but we can't approach that as though that's for sure going to happen, because we've gotten bit in the ass by that too many times in the past.
Yeah. And that's for me right now, in all artist and label conversations I'm having, NFTs are a topic that's undeniable at this point, and understanding them fully and whether they're for you or not for you, et cetera. And I honestly, I think just having the tools to make those decisions, I'm actually really excited for that track at the conference here next week. Okay. Next question. What's your favorite band that you're currently listening to?
Oh, my favorite band that I'm currently listening to is definitely Wet Leg. I feel like I'm weirdly like on a, I'm usually the maverick who's over here listening to something that nobody else is listening to, but I feel like everyone's listening to Wet Leg right now, but I really love that record. I totally love that band.
All right.
So
all right.
Can't help it.
There we go. Last and final question. Pizza or Chinese food?
Oh, and if it's in New York, it's worse. That's a worse toss-up because.
Oh yeah, this might be the hardest question I've asked you all day.
Yeah, I would say anywhere outside of New York, other than San Francisco, pizza. But in New York, oh man, I don't know. Chinese food and pizza in New York are like it's the gold standard.
Okay, so we're 50-50 on it. It sounds like we're undecided.
And I cannot claim one over the other. It's not in the city.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time today. Once again, everyone, this is Portia Sabin, Dr. Portia Sabin, who hosts the fantastic music business focused podcast, The Future of What, and is also the president of the Music Business Association, joining us today on Music Industry 360, brought to you by Symphonic. I am Randall Foster, Chief Creative Officer at Symphonic, and thank you for tuning in. We will see you and you can listen to us next time.